think we need to have a bigger conversation about accountability, because in the world today, if you work remotely or you work hybrid, whatever it looks like, you are an adult and you are expected to get your work done. But that also means, from a leadership perspective, we really have to trust our team members to get their work done. And I feel like a lot of leaders, especially as we came out of the pandemic, really struggled with that trust element into their teams, because if we couldn't see them, we couldn't understand what they were doing. And could we really trust that they were getting their work done? Which is a really dynamic, I would say, skill set leaders had to develop over the last couple of years, but it seems like you're leaning into it really heavily.
I mean, I remember going way back to my real estate days, there was a culture where you stayed until your boss left the office. You just sat there. And I remember we would literally be sitting there, not doing anything, just waiting to see if there was anything remaining for him to ask us to help with. And then he would walk out and we would 30 seconds later make sure the elevator was down and we would leave. And I think that how ridiculous was that? It was not productive for anyone involved. He probably knew that we were leaving right when he did. So why didn't we just walk down with him and say goodnight and be on our merry way? But there was this kind of purposeful waiting for him to leave, for us to leave. And I think that's of the past.
All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hart Hustle podcast. Now, I'm incredibly excited because we have an amazing leader sitting across this digital table with me. We have Rebecca Parks, who is a USO regional president of the North region, I'm guessing. So, Rebecca, welcome to the show. This is going to be an amazing conversation about your Hart and Hustle. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Keenan. I'm so excited to be here and to talk to you.
So, I think what we should really kind of cover as we get started into the episode today is a little bit about your heart. So we recognize that today you're a regional president of an amazing organization, but let's kind of rewind. So who was Rebecca as a kid, as a younger person? What kind of things kind of like got you excited about the world? Kind of take us back to that place.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was one of those kids who really thought, two things. Either one, I was going to be, president of the United States, with George Washington as my role model, or a professional athlete. I didn't really have any kind of in between. It was one of those two things. And I did sports as a kid, took up a lot of my time. I was a 3-sport varsity athlete in high school. I played lots of different sports year round. And well, I thought at the time, and, reflecting back on it, I enjoyed playing sports, but I think more than that, I really just enjoyed being part of a team. And sometimes in those cases, as I got more advanced in those sports, leading a team and being captain of a team, and what that meant as, a life lesson that I wasn't really even realizing at the time. So I, of course, also had to focus on school, and did my best in that. But I was really focused on, being kind of the best athlete I can be. And ultimately, that's what led me to even choosing the college I attended, and really kind of framed the early stages of my life early on. In addition to something that I fell in love with at a young age, around the age of 11, I fell in love with sailing and had the opportunity to very quickly become a sailing instructor. And that really was something that shaped my summers, not only doing the sailing itself, but I also was able to, with a boatyard that was very willing to let me just take on and do whatever I was able to and willing to. I learned all about kind of boat building and other things that were involved in the sport. So exposure to a lot of different things and having to interact with a lot of different people as I went through that, I think did shape a lot of my kind of future career that at the time I wouldn't have even thought about.
If I think about one of the most independent, sports, I think about sailing. I see stories of 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds who sail around the world or make vast journeys by themselves. What kind of lessons did you learn about independence and leaning on yourself when you were sailing at such a young age?
Yeah, of course. I never made it around the world. I kind of stuck to the coasts of Massachusetts, but I think it does teach you, you really do have to be in control of a vessel out in the open, sea. So, all those things that you have to pay very close attention to while you do that, the depth of the water, the wind, other boats. And so all of those factors play a part of what it means to be out at sea on a sailboat when, the ones that we sailed, they didn't have an engine. So you were needing to find your way out and back, kind of using nature. And I think that that in of itself is something that, can teach you different aspects of patience, but also, just paying attention, really focusing on something at that time. At the boatyard, one of the things that we did as instructors is we were also responsible for trying to fill the lessons up and find people and do some marketing and advertising and talk to parents of the kids who were taking the lessons, word of mouth, trying to get other people to learn about what we were doing as a sailing school. So that, really was something, early on. Again, when you're doing it, you're not thinking about it in the context of career, but, with some early sales skills, also dealing with customers, so customer service, and having to, think about, parents are sending their kids out with us on the open water, the concerns that they have, and making them feel comfortable for doing that. And then also ultimately having a great experience at the end where they want to keep coming back summer after summer.
I want to talk a little bit about your competitive greatness. So I also was a 3-sport athlete in high school all the way through, then went to go play college baseball. And then I realized at one point in time that my athletic career was going to end like it does for so many of us. And I had a mentor come to me and say, Keenan, now that your dream of being a pro baseball player has kind of, the chapter has turned, now we have to take your competitive greatness and you have to figure out what you're going to turn pro at next. What was your process of turning pro next at something beyond the athletics field? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I love that. I love that concept of turning pro next. And I think it's, one of the things that when we prepped for this call, what I loved about the name of the podcast in of itself, that hustle, right? Competitiveness, there's a hustle to being competitive, and there's a hustle to taking your skills and developing it to be not only the best you can be, but doing it at a competitive, highly competitive level. And ultimately whatever that pro looks like. And so for me, it was really the development of kind of being a pro leader of a sports team that I think I focused on building. So, without knowing it, I ended up being able to guide a lot of players that came after me in what their college experience or high school experience and ultimately their athletic experience looked like. And I think I did that without even knowing it, by being someone who they could come to, who would listen to them, give advice to them, and ultimately coach them into becoming a better player and a better teammate, and what that meant. And so now I do that as a leader of a very different kind of team. But I also use that. I think there's a communication aspect of that. And so one of the things that I was attracted to right out of college was kind of this field of sales. So selling things to people, where you had to, use different skills of convincing, persuasive skills in your communication to get someone interested in a certain product. And I started off with real estate, and then very quickly realized that while that was fun, I wanted to do something that was more impactful. And so since that early time of selling real estate in New York City, I've used that leadership and persuasion and communication of influence to ultimately convince people to believe in different missions of the nonprofits that I've worked for and consulted for.
Here's a question for you. Now, this is really important because often I feel like there's a social narrative that says when we start a professional career, right, we should go into an area specifically and focus on that for a really long time in order to get good. But you started in real estate, then pivoted. What was part of that superpower of changing your mind to recognize that real estate wasn't for me and I can apply my skill set in a different direction? Because I feel like a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate. And again, I think one of the things that you do learn, kind of going back to where we started about kind of the concept of being in and involved around a team, is you learn that you have to also, be aware of your environment and find people that surround you that can give you good advice. And so I was fortunate to be surrounded by people who were doing a lot of different things. I sold real estate to people who had a lot of careers. And as I did that, I observed the different things that they were doing. I also got involved as a volunteer Starting off as kind of back to my passion, I started off coaching sports at a local YMCA. And through that realized, what the YMCA was more than just a membership based organization that had youth sports programs, that it was really a community organization where different underserved populations and kids in particular were able to come after school and for programs, so that they could have different advantages in life that they wouldn't otherwise have. And in working with some of the people there, I learned that in order to do that, they needed to raise money. And ultimately, I kind of made the connection myself that I'm asking people to give money for a beautiful New York City apartment. I can definitely go and do that for something that helps some of these kids that were living in, hard neighborhoods in the city have access to youth sports and after school programs. And so I did that at first as a volunteer. And then out of different networking and again, listening and kind of learning from people that were around me, realized that there were people who did that as a career. I hadn't known that, going into college or picking a major or anything like that. But I did meet a lot of people now that I was in New York City who had made a career in bringing money into different mission oriented organizations. And I started doing that for the YMCA of Greater New York. I also I don't know if anyone's ever in New York, but you kind of see the New York City Police Foundation and the horses that some of the New York City police officers, use as they kind of do their jobs in the city. And those horses are funded by the foundation and through the generous donations of different people living in different foundations in the city. And so I learned that, and I asked, is there a way that I could help the foundation? And so I started volunteering for different organizations and had access to a lot of just different information on what it meant to run and be part of, and then ultimately fundraise for a nonprofit. And that's what got me hooked into saying I can still build and use a lot of these skills in sales, but I'm selling a cause, I'm selling a purpose, and I'm selling a mission. And that felt like something that not only would be able to allow me to use some of my skill set, but also kind of mix that purpose and passion together, to kind of find the right position ultimately for at that time from a career standpoint.
You said something that was really powerful. You've used some words incredibly intentionally. You've talked about mission. We've talked about purpose. You also said listening in there, which I think is really interesting. I want to double click on that. What is the importance of listening in today's world while we're exploring what our career paths could mean? Because the social narrative says that we should be as loud as possible. People are always talking, but I feel like often we don't take the time to listen. And those lessons that we learn through listening can inform our careers and the trajectory of our lives. So why is listening something that you mentioned there? Because it's really interesting to me.
I think listening is absolutely the most powerful tool. And it's been one that hasn't been that easy for me to even build as a skill set, because just not anyone who likes to communicate, likes to talk, their natural instinct is to just share information and want to, provide someone who they're in a conversation with or in a room with the most information possible in hopes that they take it all in and that the purpose for which they come there for is fulfilled. And I think it's the reverse. And it's been one of those things over my career that I've worked on, I've challenged myself to work on, and it's not easy. But listening is ultimately where you get the ability to persuade and influence and ultimately have that fulfillment with an individual or a group of individuals that you're interacting with, because everyone's motivation is different and you can't find out what motivates different individuals without listening to them. And that goes for people on my teams as well. What motivates them to want to be in the roles that they are, or what they want to do with their careers. And so how you coach people on your own team, it's so important to listen to them and take cues from where they're at in order to be able to help coach and guide them and ultimately help them shape their own careers for the future as well. So I think, listening is the gold that ultimately connects us all and makes for a really strong team, a strong organization, a strong company, that if more people listen to one another, we ultimately, become better people and better coworkers and colleagues and all of those many things.
It's easy to tell how you are a captain of your teams because all these lessons that we kind of have been able to pull out of this conversation have been absolutely amazing. And you're right. I mean, listening is a superpower, especially for leaders, right? If you think about some of the most fulfilling roles and responsibilities and fulfillment that comes from our work, often people say, when I have an idea, my leaders listen. And that in itself is just like such a small nuance that has such a huge multiplicative impact on just the culture of an organization as well. I want to pivot a little bit into the amazing work that you guys do at USO. So I know you spent some time consulting in the UK and Europe, and you brought all those experiences back to eventually finding your role in the USO. So let's talk about what attracted you to the USO and some of the, I would say, early low-hanging fruit where you saw you could have a huge impact in the organization.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I mean, I spent a lot of time, again, starting with the YMCA of Greater New York, but really built on that in a career that I took from New York City overseas to Europe, back to Boston, and being in Boston ultimately brought me to the role that I have now at the USO, which while I'm in Boston, I oversee now 22 states across the North region. But what initially attracted me to the USO, it was one of those, again, some might say serendipitous, but it really was around just different people giving me information. And a former colleague of mine who is in the DC area, which is where the USO is headquartered, said, I know you're not necessarily thinking of something right now, but maybe soon in the future. And have you seen this role with the USO? And my initial reaction was, what is the USO? And for someone who had spent a lot of time in, I think, major markets in the nonprofit space, I always, and as a consultant too. And so as a consultant, one of my jobs was to sell our services to as many nonprofits as feasibly possible, right? And be out there at conferences and meeting new other leaders in the nonprofit space. And so to have not heard of an organization was surprising to me. And then when I did go in and dig into the USO, it was even that much more surprising to me. Like, how could I not have heard of this place? I didn't have a huge military history in my family. The closest relative to me that had served in the military was my grandfather, who had served in World War II and had passed when I was very young. So I didn't have that connection with him. Since I've had a cousin who's joined and enlisted in the Navy, but I didn't have that deep military connection. So there's a potential that that's one of the reasons that I hadn't heard of the USO. But when I dug into it and started having some initial conversations about the USO, an 80-plus-year-old organization, I was moved by the fact that there was this historic, really powerful, well-known in its space organization, especially with the linkage to Bob Hope, the historic entertainment component of the organization, that wasn't widely known. Because when I started asking some of my closest network, and honestly, my age demographic about the USO, they were like, yeah, no, we've not heard of that. And then you would, kind of go on Google and everyone would have the same reaction, like, okay, yeah, no, I kind of know what this organization does. And so given my career path and where I was and all the many organizations that I had helped, I thought it was an amazing opportunity for an organization that had historically and culturally framed so much of American society at a certain era to be able to be part of that future. And ultimately, in my role and in some of my team's roles, really shape the awareness component that was missing potentially in some of the major markets that I had lived in for the USO, and bring some more awareness to the brand, and not only the historic aspect of the brand, but what the organization was doing now and what our hope was to do in the future with a very different demographic of military constituents than we had to serve back in the World War II timeframe. So that to me was an opportunity to build and to grow a new era of a very historic and important organization.
I feel like your story is so beautiful because you didn't come from a family of military background. Now you're exposed to this organization and you're saying, okay, now we have a huge opportunity to enhance awareness, right, across the regions that we serve, but also among populations of people who are very similar to your family upbringing. I think it's interesting to me how when you live in a region of the country that has military bases, Air Force, Navy, Army, XYZ, you're aware of these things. But when you're not in these regions, often they're out of sight, out of mind. Is that kind of like the realization that you had when you saw like your opportunity in front of you? I'm guessing that you had some conversations with family members about, hey, I'm going to go work for this organization. And they said, what is that? And you said, I can take all of my experiences and kind of rally them into this opportunity to create a better message for the organization.
Absolutely. I think certainly if you live in places like Texas and North Carolina and Norfolk, Virginia, San Diego, California, there are communities where when those members of the community are going to their Target or grocery store, you're seeing people coming to and from base, Starbucks before and after work. And when I travel around and I'm nearby a larger military base, I see that, at the local Starbucks or the local, Dunkin' Donuts, whatever that may be. You start to realize like I'm close to this location because I'm starting to see that activity. Here in Boston or walking down the streets of Manhattan, or you have to know where to see different, people in uniform. And if I see someone in uniform, walking down in the Seaport in Boston or in Midtown Manhattan, my eyes now draw to that because I'm like, where are they going? Where are they coming from? Because it's so unique to see that in one of those cities. Now at a train station, you see in New York, the Empire Shield Guard, but they're sort of embedded in the framework of that. And so you're used to seeing that. But where you're not used to seeing it, I'm now surprised. And before I might have not even noticed. So now I'm starting to notice it because I'm part of the community. And I do think that, there is a big role that the USO can play in helping bridge the civilian military divide and bring more attention to the American public who are in many ways fortunate to have kind of that out of sight, out of mind mindset and don't even know how fortunate they are to feel that because of all those individuals and their families who have volunteered to serve in the American Armed Forces. So that freedom and the ability to feel that, more people, I believe, should understand and appreciate that there's a reason that they're able to feel that way. And that because they're able to feel that way, they should give back. They should think about a way to give back, whether that's through volunteering with the USO or being part of another organization in this space. I do think that there's a freedom offered by having that ability to feel that way that everyone should start thinking about more.
And it's individuals like you who have a heart for this work that really kind of transition into why the hustle is so necessary to spread these messages. I want to talk a little bit about the hustle that's involved in the work that you do to be able to spread the message about the USO, but also create more awareness. Now, in the world today, often there's a misrepresentation or misunderstanding that nonprofits in general, right, are helping cultures, right? These are nice people who are just here to be able to take out, opportunities that come to them. We're going to go out and we're going to try and spread the message, but often people don't understand the hustle that's behind this work. So what does hustle mean to you in the work that you do specifically in spreading this message about the USO?
I think for me, hustle can mean, both small and large things. Day to day, the hustle is that, we are always working to engage new companies, participants, volunteers, the military leadership in ensuring that the USO mission continues. And so that's really the day to day. I think when you think about it in a different way, I think for us, the hustle is also just a curiosity and a curiosity around why, I always ask myself, why isn't someone involved in our organization today? And I get curious about that. I want to understand why. What has made them so that they're not interested to learn more? What has made it so that they're not interested to maybe take a phone call? And so that curiosity almost drives the persistence of trying to find out, hey, I think this organization's great. So many others think that the organization's great. We've had a lot of historic partners like Coca-Cola and, Delta Airlines, American Airlines. So there are some really big companies who believe in our mission. And so the large hustle is, why isn't everyone? Why isn't every single person living in America today supporting the USO? And I think that drives the hustle because it drives the curiosity of why not. And then you start to look at, okay, well, we want to get all of our sports teams involved. So why isn't every major and minor league sports team doing something in the salute to service or troops for, seats for troops nights across the country? I think they should. I think every single sports team should be supporting the USO at least one day a year. So why aren't they? And then that drives your hustle.
I mean, I think, first of all, curiosity is one of my cornerstones. If we are not curious, right, we cannot search for meaning and we cannot search for understanding, which gives us the opportunity to hustle after an opportunity. When you think about hustle, often over the last couple of years, there's been so much negative, I would say, headlines and narratives about hustling. And we've really kind of leaned towards work-life balance and we shouldn't be working that hard, XYZ. But when we're talking about meaningful work, is there a time where we can go into a season of hustle to accomplish that meaningful work rather than searching for balance? What's kind of your 2 cents on that?
I agree. I think hustle and work-life balance have unfortunately become this conflicting topic that everyone is trying to figure out. And remote work, which I do, and a lot of our employees, in fact, are remote employees. I think that that's added to that conversation and confused it in some ways the wrong way. It used to be that when we were in offices, hustle was defined by how many hours you sat in an office. And I think people have tried to take that and say, well, it still is hustle is how many hours you work. I've been working for 15 hours today. My answer to that is I really don't care. If that's really what it took for you to get everything done that you thought you needed to get done today, okay. But just because it's the length of hours doesn't define that you hustled. And it also doesn't define that you really worked smart. And so I am very much a person about accountability. We know what we're looking to get done. We know the outcomes that we want to achieve. It is unrealistic that you're doing that 24/7. So you figure that out. What does that mean for you? If it means that you need to take a walk in the morning to get your head straight and then you work 7 hours straight, great. If it means that you need to work in 20-minute increments and in between those increments, you need to do something that gives you a mental pause, fine. And so I think that we've had to put some more self-accountability on people to say, you figure out your balance, you set your boundaries, but you got to get your job done. And here are the things that I'm going to use to measure that. And you figure out how to make those two things coexist. So I am a huge proponent of that. I practice that. I am not on, emails all night. I don't send people emails at midnight thinking that they're going to read them and expecting a response. So it is like one of my biggest beliefs. And we talk as a team, my leadership team and my whole team about this, about kind of setting your own boundary. If you have a doctor's appointment, say so. Don't, just say I have to go to the doctor's today. Okay, go to the doctor. Hours, I think, no longer define hustle. And I think that that's used to be the case. And I think we've proved that wrong as a society.
It reminds me of being like in high school, right? And then being asked to make sure you're attending class and getting all your work done, XYZ. And then you go to college. And for the first time in your life, you're said, go get your work done on your own.
Right.
And a lot of people struggle in that element of accountability. I think we need to have a bigger conversation about accountability because in the world today, if you work remotely or you work hybrid, whatever it looks like, you are an adult and you are expected to get your work done. But that also means from a leadership perspective, we really have to trust our team members to get their work done. And I feel like a lot of leaders, especially as we came out of the pandemic, really struggled with that trust element into their teams because if we couldn't see them, we couldn't understand what they were doing. And could we really trust that they were getting their work done? Which is a really dynamic, I would say, skill set leaders had to develop over the last couple of years, but it seems like you're leaning into it really heavily.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, I remember going way back to my real estate days, there was a culture where you stayed until your boss left the office. You just sat there. And I remember we would literally be sitting there, not doing anything, just waiting to see if there was anything remaining for him to ask us to help with. And then he would walk out and we would 30 seconds later make sure the elevator was down and we would leave. And I think that how ridiculous was that? It was not productive for anyone involved. He probably knew that we were leaving right when he did. So why didn't we just walk down with him and say goodnight and be on our merry way? But there was this kind of purposeful waiting for him to leave, for us to leave. And I think that's of the past. I don't think that that's coming back. And because of that, it means that outcomes-based accountability has to drive our businesses forward, whether that's a for-profit or a nonprofit business. And that could be revenue. It could be different KPIs related to your mission deliverables. And I think staying focused on those things help everyone, and making sure that everyone involved realizes what their role is in driving those forward, then allows people to have that breath of, I am an adult, I can have my balance, I can manage this myself, and I'm still going to stay focused on these key drivers.
What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned in being a team leader outside of the athletic space? If you could go back, let's say 10 years and have a conversation with Rebecca, you have 5 minutes of uninterrupted time where you can sit down and really hammer some lessons into your younger version of yourself to help them navigate the time until they meet me here today in this recording. What conversation would you really kind of lean into with that younger version of yourself?
So, I mean, there's two things. One is kind of the first lesson I had in kind of more management than leadership. And I think there's a component where there's overlap in both, but in management, you're responsible for the work of the people you manage. And I don't think I fully understood and appreciated what that meant for quite a long time. In theory, I understood, right? Oh yes, I'm responsible for them. I manage them. I supervise them. I lead them even because, I think innately I wanted to help these people. But I think there is a part of management and leadership where you also have to make sure the right people are on the ship. You have the right crew on the boat in order to meet those objectives. And the hardest part I have found is realizing when you don't. And then what do you do then? And I had a great leader about that time frame 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where I was having some challenges with some of the people on my team. And sometimes the teams that you have aren't necessarily the teams you choose. It's by virtue of different, departments shuffle and you inherit a new team or something like that. And I remember probably after a few times coming into that person's office for my one-on-one and saying, I'm having challenges with so-and-so, they're still not meeting their objectives. And they looked at me very kind of sternly and said, if you can't manage them, I will have to manage you. And that was a very harsh way of basically saying it's your responsibility. And ultimately, at some point, their lack of performance turns into your lack of performance. And you have to address it. And there's a couple of ways of addressing it. You can manage them up to perform better, or make the realization that they're not the right person for the team. They're not able to do their job. And we have processes in place that address that. And I think that has still been the hardest thing for me as a leader, is figuring out the timing and the processes of which come to a place where you realize I might not have the right people on this team for what we need to get done, and then having to address that.
That conversation with your leader, did it come across in the moment as dismissive, or did it come across as more empowering when we can look at it back now with a little bit of perspective?
I think I was in shock, honestly. I don't know that it was dismissive. It was probably empowering because it has been one of those things that I have honestly never forgotten throughout my entire career. When I think about managing people and even helping my team leaders manage people, it has been something that has stuck with me because there is some hard truth to it. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, I think I was just surprised and taken back, and probably went back into my office and thought, okay, well, what do I do? Because I don't want this to become my problem. But it was my problem because they were my team. And it goes back to the sports analogy, right? And I have an 8-year-old playing sports now, and I watch these, 8-year-olds play sports, and they start to blame each other very quickly. Your fault. you let the goal in. You didn't score or whatever that may be. And I was a goalie.
Hmm.
So I had a lot put on my shoulders of blame of myself when we would lose a game because I let in more goals than we were able to score. But at the end of the day, when you have to realize this is a team, we win and we lose as a team. And so that whole aspect of what that means in the work setting and in the professional space, I think is really important because I do see that sometimes when there is an underperformer, if you have team members who have a colleague who is an underperformer, it impacts all of them. And so as a leader, it is your responsibility for those hardworking high performers on your team to address that underperformance. And so that is also something that I've learned over time, that while it feels like in the moment, you're changing the course of someone's life by dealing with that underperformance, you're also changing the course of your entire team. And it's the same thing that a coach would have to deal with. If they have someone who's on the field and they're not performing at their best, they're going to have to move to the bench for a little bit. And then when tryouts come, if that person still hasn't improved, they may not make the team again. And so I think that there is a hard truth to that, but I think it's what ultimately really successful organizations do well. They make sure that they have the best people on the team in the right roles, and with the right leaders.
And sometimes being a leader is all about finding that stretch, right, in our team members. There's an amazing quote from an author named Kevin Kelly, and he says in his book, "You lead by letting others know what you expect of them, which may exceed what they expect of themselves. Provide them a reputation that they can live up to." What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love that quote. And, I think that there's a lot of different aspects in that quote that, we've kind of been talking about in different shapes and forms. I think the other piece to that is I also think that, if for someone who has a high expectation of performance, and sometimes with that comes pace. So I always talk a lot about pace. And there was another quote, and I don't have it in front of me. It might have been a GIF even, that was just talking about that at some point, you can outpace people. You can outpace your competition too. Doesn't have to be outsmart them, but it does have to mean outpace them. And I think curiosity and all of those different things, persistence and being persuasive and doing that in a very methodical but fast pace and not letting failure hold you back. That ultimately is also what drives organizations to outperform, competition.
How is your relationship with failure? Knowing that you come from a sports background, right? Recognizing that failure is a way for us to learn quickly, implement new changes, and then see the results after that. How have you been able to shape your relationship with failure outside of your sports world into your professional life?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like to lose, and I don't think any really any no athlete likes to lose, right? We're driven to win. You do lose though, right? There are no matter you look at any of the professional sports teams, right? Kansas City Chiefs, they just lost, so you do lose, and I think losing with grace and losing with good sportsmanship and using loss or failure to learn lessons, I think is something that we all have to come to terms with over time. I still don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable, and I think that uncomfort is what ultimately lets me reflect upon things. It lets me want to improve, and so I have a strong desire where if something doesn't go right, I want to make it better the next time. And I'm not going to sit there and sit on it for a while. Because again, going back to the sports analogy, like the next game is 3 days away. You got to get back on the practice field. You got to figure out what went wrong, watch tape. Again, if something, even sometimes I've looked at different email exchanges in the professional world. If something didn't go quote unquote in the way that I wanted to or expected it to an outcome, was there something in the email exchange that caused that? What are the little details as well as the big details that might have caused a certain outcome, and can we learn from that? So I think it's, again, uncomfortable. It's not fun, but you do have to move on quickly and learn from it and hope that, if you get a no in sales, hopefully it's not a no, it's a not now. And you can keep trying at some point in time and come back. The cycle changes, right? People's values change over time, right? In different life phases. So I always look at people when they've said no to something or don't respond, that it's really them saying, not now, but you can come back to me. And I'm always happy for people to come back to me as well, because there are times where, I've said no or not now to something. And I actually appreciate when someone comes back around and says, hey, have you ever thought about reconsidering this?
How do you separate the results from your professional life to the identity of Rebecca? One of the things I know a lot of leaders struggle with when things aren't going well business wise, we look at that as a personal reflection upon ourselves. And some of my favorite leaders, like this guy, Gary Vaynerchuk here, goes by Gary V on social media, talks a lot about I am completely separate from who I am compared to the results that I get in business. And I've always been envious of that because I really struggle with that. Have you been able to make that separation between your professional results and the value that you see in yourself?
I mean, yes and no. I don't know that sometimes I feel like it's okay to not have that complete separation, because I believe in authenticity, and I think who I am in business, it's not exactly how I am kind of when I'm off, but I try to be authentic and bring my authentic self to different situations. And so in that case, I wouldn't say that they're completely separate, but I do take that separation and that break from work, whatever it may be doing. Again, having an 8-year-old who's very involved in their own things on the weekends, that helps. I have a dog. He needs to go for walks, and we go for walks, and I listen to podcasts that I enjoy. Some of those are business related. Some of those are completely not related to anything related to business. And so I do try to take those times to just kind of be myself without having that hat on of outcomes and, moving something forward and my kind of day-to-day job. But I'm sure just, I'm like, right. It's like one of those things where I think we could all probably continue to improve on that, do better, try to really take those times where you're not thinking about, things at work. But at the same time, I would say, I love what I do. And I don't find it necessarily to be considered working when I'm reading an article that might, help with something that, in my case, moves the USO's mission forward. So I think there's a love that I have. And that's when I talk about like the passion and the purpose of being in this space. I think it allows you some of that freedom of this is work, but I do love it. And sometimes it doesn't feel like work when I'm, reading an article.
I mean, and we are some of the lucky ones because I feel the same way. I love the work that I do. I love being able to show up, have these type of conversations, but also just share stories. And I feel like when you can find that beautiful mix of the work that you do, but also the passion that's behind it, and then you also get compensated for that and you can provide for your family and everybody else, what a beautiful place to be. And I hope that so many more people can kind of, find that passion at one point in time in their life. So, Rebecca, one of the traditions we have here on the podcast as we kind of put the wheels down is our previous guest wanted to ask you a blind question. Okay. Now, this is an amazing leader who's been doing some amazing work in the Southeast region of the country, working with youth and empowering youth through different after-school programs. Her question came with a little bit of context. She said, often very early in life, we have things figured out, but we have an important conversation with somebody who we admire, a loved one, a grandparent, where they inspire us to kind of take on the challenges of life. So if you could go back to have a conversation with your 5-year-old self, what would you two talk about?
Oh, that's a good question. What would we talk about to my 5-year-old self? You know what? I think I would tell myself, I wish I found authenticity earlier. And I think I would tell my 5-year-old self that all of the things that you're doing, again, I was like a tomboy, really into sports, and you just get a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles. And I wish I could tell myself that you can be your authentic self this whole time, and that will be okay. And all of the things and the different pressures and the different people that are going to put pressure on you to not be that or to challenge that, you don't have to worry about them. Don't listen to them. Because I think that that takes up for people a lot of wasted mental space. People's opinions of us, which happens from age 5 all the way through adulthood and on, people have their opinions. And I think I wish I learned earlier that you just do you and keep going.
Do you, boo? I feel like that is a beautiful place for us to put a wrapper on today's episode. Rebecca, it's easy to understand for everybody who's been tuning in, watching, and listening to today's episode that you are the definition of heart and hustle. From your early days in being a sports leader, a captain, going to work at the YMCA, going overseas and having consulting experience, then coming back and pouring so much of your passion into the work that you do at the USO is an amazing story. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I know, obviously the heart comes from your name, but I love that you've kind of combined the heart and the hustle. I think it's so important and really appreciate joining you today.
Guys, we'll catch you in the next one. That's a wrap.